Good evening, everyone. So my name is Peter Steeves, and it's my privilege to be the director of the DePaul Humanities Center. And I'm pleased to welcome you to the very first event in our new season, this year of filth, this year of scale, rather, as tonight we investigate atomic wastes. But we begin first, as we always begin at the Humanities Center, by acknowledging the traditional territory upon which we gather this evening. Long before Europeans arrived, varied and numerous native people sought to walk gently on this land. They offered assistance to the first European travelers to this territory, sharing their knowledge for survival and living the good life. Among others, the Potawatomi, Ojibwe, Miami, and Illinois inhabited what is now this part of Chicago. While we here today have no power to honor the treaties that were signed, we do recognize that these treaties were brokered under some duress and deception. So it's our hope tonight to honor the good faith with which the native people of the region entered into these treaties. As Potawatomi Chief Matea is purported to have said at the signing of the 1821 Treaty of Chicago, quote, "This is a small piece of land, and if we give it away, what will become of us? The Great Spirit, who has provided it for our use, allows us to keep it. We should incur his anger if we bartered it away. If we had more land, you would get more. But our land has been wasting away ever since the white people became our neighbors, and we have now hardly enough left to cover the bones of our tribe." In solidarity with Chief Matea, we recognize the history and legacy of this subjugation, as well as the enduring presence today of Native Americans among our faculty, staff, student body, and community. And it's thus that we seek a new relationship with the original peoples of this land, one based on true respect, as we also reaffirm our general and driving dedication to finding ways both institutionally and personally for the work that we do at the DePaul Humanities Center to be a model of what it means to be dedicated to making our society a more enlightened and just place for everyone in our community. So, it will soon be my honor to introduce to you our three guests this evening, but I thought I might begin with a few introductory words about the topic around which we convene. Although tonight is the result of a postponed event from last year when the polar vortex was making it about 100 degrees colder than it is right now, literally, and our topic then was filth, it's fitting that we start our new season of scale at the atomic level, at a dimension that's very small in scale, at least by the standards of everyday experience. So how then did we come to conceive of atoms, to imagine such a scale was even possible? In the West, the idea of atomism goes back about 2,500 years. Democritus was one of the first to suggest that because there seemed to be no infinities in the real world, it is likely impossible to keep cutting things in half and then in half again and so on forever. At some point, the smallest parts of things must be uncovered, with no further division being possible. The word atom comes to us from the Greek word atomon, which means indivisible. Because Aristotle rejected this idea, and Aristotle became the foundation for pre-Enlightenment science, the idea of atoms was more or less abandoned for nearly 2 millennia. Until the 17th century, really, and the time of Descartes, Hobbes, and Galileo. Atomism's acceptance in the 17th and 18th centuries meant that many philosophers and scientists championed the idea that reality was composed of small, indivisible, indestructible things that we cannot see with the naked eye. Amazingly, it was only more or less a century ago that it was shown that atoms are neither the smallest bits of matter, nor are they indestructible. Atoms decay, they can be torn apart, and they're made up of electrons, the first subatomic particles ever discovered, neutrons, and protons. It took a couple more decades and the invention of the particle accelerator until we could be sure that electrons, it seems, really are fundamental. But protons and neutrons are made of even smaller things. Quarks. Quarks, which come in 6 different types called flavors, are held together by force-carrying particles called gluons. Gluons carry the so-called strong nuclear force, making protons, for instance, stick together even though they're all positively charged and want to repel each other. In this role, gluons are said to carry the color force. These massless particles, according to the standard model of particle physics, have a charge called a color charge. Something like the more familiar positive and negative charges of protons and electrons, but color charges come in 3 basic types: red, green, and blue. Now, the sort of radiation that perhaps most interests us tonight is ionizing radiation. Ionizing radiation carries enough energy to do damage when it interacts with other atoms, because it can break down chemical bonds and ionize, that is, strip electrons away from atoms and molecules. So in case you didn't have a chance to read some of the material I wrote for the gallery out in the foyer, I'll summarize a few of the most relevant points here. Cosmic rays that penetrate the Earth's atmosphere are one source of ionizing radiation. So are X-rays from medical exams. But the most common sources of ionizing radiation come from radioactive materials that emit alpha, beta, or gamma radiation. An alpha particle is basically just a helium nucleus. A beta particle is just an electron, or a positron, and gamma radiation is made up of photons. Alpha particles originating from ordinary alpha decay usually don't do damage to living things. The equivalent of a helium nucleus, that's 2 protons and 2 neutrons, they have a relatively large mass and charge, and thus they interact with matter strongly. They can be stopped by just a few millimeters of low-density material. The layer of dead skin cells on your body is enough to stop most normal alpha particles from penetrating any further and doing any really real damage to your cells. Beta particles, when they occur naturally, can pass through a few centimeters of material usually. When a neutron decays inside the nucleus of an atom, it creates an energetic electron, called the beta particle, and an antineutrino. Beta radiation, though, is basically just a supercharged electron, nothing overly exotic. Gamma radiation is actually a particular kind of photon, that is, a light particle, with a wavelength less than 3 times 10 to the negative 11th meters, very, very small. After a nuclear reaction takes place and a nucleus has an unstable excess of energy, that energy is released as gamma radiation. Alpha and beta radiation is made of matter, so it's easily blocked by matter. But gamma radiation, made up of massless photons, is capable of moving through matter somewhat more easily. Still, barriers made of an element that has a high atomic number, meaning more protons in the nucleus, are the greatest hope to provide stopping power. That's why your dentist puts a lead apron over your chest to protect you when you're getting X-rays, which are very close cousins to gamma rays. Gamma radiation can be very dangerous since it can easily reach internal organs and bones, ionizing atoms in living tissue that the body can't easily repair. These then are some of the wonders and dangers of radioactive decay. It's perhaps worth remembering that if we step back a bit, we find that at the atomic level, as at every level of reality, the narrative is being written by entropy, and decay is in general, is entropy's endgame. Every atom in the universe is decaying. Some are just decaying faster than others. It is true that a radioactive atom is just an unstable atom trying to get stable. This is why, most commonly, an atom with more neutrons than protons in its nucleus might eject a neutron by having it change into a proton, plus an electron and an antineutrino. A neutron left on its own decays in just a few minutes. When inside an atom, the process is slowed down considerably. But once that extra neutron was gone, it was thought that a stable atom was the result. And a stable atom was once thought not to change with time. Throughout history, humans have seemed to be fascinated with the idea of something permanent, something that never changes. A proton is composed of 2 up quarks and 1 down quark. Now, there are several competing theories for unifying the forces and combining the quantum world and Einstein's general relativity. But odds are that a proton will eventually fall apart. And its lifespan is probably somewhere around 10 to the 32nd years. In fact, there is probably even a shelf life to an electron, which, as I noted, is not typically thought to be composed of anything smaller. So it's a rather controversial claim to say that it could decay, though there are some investigating whether an electron might eventually decay into a photon and a neutrino. The bet is that the electron's lifespan, if it has one, is greater than 60,000 yada years. If you're unfamiliar with the prefix yada, it is the decimal unit prefix for a factor of 10 to the 24th power. For comparison, the width of the diameter of the observable universe is currently 0.88 yada meters. That is, the universe isn't even 1 yada meter wide. So 60,000 yada years, which is 5 quintillion times longer than the current age of the universe, is a long time, a lot of yada. Still, the point remains, everything comes to an end, eventually. So I'll come back briefly to the science of all this again in a moment, but Before getting too far afield, let me just say that when I was rebuilding the Geiger counter and accumulating all of the radioactive items on display out there, it gave me a chance to think not only about nuclear science, but, for lack of a better term, nuclear humanities. When fixing up a device such as the one on display, one must be aware of how beta particles, for instance, interact with and ionize the gas inside the tube of the Geiger counter in order to create a flow of current and thus a little click on the meter. But as I was doing this work, it occurred to me that there are humanities-based commitments involved in the task long before there are science-based commitments. This is true of any work, and certainly true of any scientific work, of course. We commit ourselves to the values built into the tools we're using in the moment. And whenever we pick up those tools, we pick up those values. Even to be doing one thing instead of another is to find value in that one thing as opposed to the other. So all science work is always already soaked through with values that are ethical, political, and aesthetic, and are inseparable from the work itself. But the true point is even deeper, I think. To think of the world as composed of smaller things we cannot directly experience is to conceptualize reality as something that is inaccessible to everyday experience. This in itself is a commitment of a certain kind, one that takes empiricism in a new direction. Now, I know that we're lucky to have some physicists with us tonight, but assuming for the moment you don't have a background in physics, you might have been willing to accept the general story of radiation that I've been recounting here because our culture doesn't have much of a problem with atomism any longer. Remember, though, that this is a relatively recent development. 400 years ago, everything I've said for the last few minutes would sound like madness. But let's assume that even without a degree in physics, you don't find much exotic or questionable in the idea of, say, beta radiation being a supercharged electron zooming around space. But you might not have had the same reaction when I started talking about flavored quarks and color charges. Perhaps when it comes to these somewhat bizarre terms, you started thinking, well, isn't that just a weird metaphor? After all, quarks don't have a taste at all, and charges can't be seen, so they don't really have any color. And this, of course, is true. Everything is a metaphor. Spin, charge, color. Even quarks themselves get their name from physics Nobel laureate Murray Gell-Mann, who died just 3.5 months ago, and his knowledge of the metaphors of literature. Gell-Mann read James Joyce's novel Finnegan's Wake, which was published in 1939, the same year that nuclear fission was discovered, and Einstein wrote his famous letter to FDR to warn him of the dangers of uranium being used to build a new kind of devastating bomb that could function on what he called an atomic level. 25 years later, Gell-Mann remembered a strange word that Joyce had made up in that novel, appearing in just one sentence. 3 quarks for Muster Mark. It was unclear what a quark was in Joyce's mind, and even what this sentence means. So Gell-Mann took the word, conscripting it as the name for the smallest of all small particles, and thus we have quarks in physics. Pretty delicious. So it's metaphors all the way down. No charges are really colored, but no charges are really positive or negative either. It's just that we're more used to hearing those terms, so we don't question them. But let's be clear, no particles are really spinning up or down. Gravity is not more truly a field than space-time is an elastic tarp that's stretched. Electrons do not orbit a nucleus, neither do they find their probable place in a cloud surrounding the nucleus. All of these are metaphors. But that's not saying that the science is fake or relative, because metaphors are real. They are the medium in which all concepts rise to meaning. And concepts are a way of making sense of the world, for good or for bad. Different disciplines have different rules for judging whether or not the concepts are good and useful, and whether or not they're being correctly employed. Science requires claims that can be repeatedly tested and are falsifiable, for instance. So in my remaining time, let me try to suggest how some of the conceptualizing related to the values floating around nuclear thinking is complicated and perhaps even wrong-headed, precisely because we have not come together to think about that thinking, to evaluate how best to judge the concepts being used ethically, politically, even aesthetically. Now, most of the people that I know who work in sustainable energy argue that we have to face the fact that some kind of nuclear energy is the only option we have for the future, the only possibility for sustaining our way of life, because all other power sources just can't meet our needs once we run out of fossil fuels. There's a lot to unpack there, actually, and if we had more time, I would try to explain carefully why I'm not a fan of sustainable energy discussions. It mostly has to do with the fact that I don't think we should be trying to find a way to sustain our current way of life in any manner whatsoever. So sustainability already stacks the deck and leads to bad things. But for now, let's just admit that if we compare nuclear energy to solar energy, it looks like there's a big difference. It's true that the infrastructures needed to deploy both are different. Nuclear energy will always require governments and corporations to run it. Solar energy might eventually be able to be farmed from your own backyard with no massive infrastructure or institutionalized oversight. But we often think that the major difference is the waste. Nuclear waste, we are told, is toxic for thousands of years, and solar power is clean. It has no waste. This, however, is not really true. Solar power requires such intense mining in order to get the metals and materials needed to make the panels that it's actually a pretty filthy power source. Yet we need to go even deeper than this. There is an underlying ideology that nuclear power and solar power have in common. And that is that power is something that's just sitting around dormant in nature, and it's waiting there for us to release it, to let it run free, and then to use it however we want. We can think of it this way. The steam engine was invented by James Watt in 1775, which led to the Industrial Revolution over the next century. But our very conception of what it means to have and use energy changed due to the new technology of the steam engine. Energy before the steam engine was typically a question of muscle power, either human or animal. And muscle power, that's always in short supply. Muscles need to rest. They need to be respected and nurtured. If you had a draft horse on the farm, that horse would need care. You could only work him so much, and sometimes you had to cajole or coax him to work. It was a relationship, and a relationship that made demands on those who wanted the energy. But all of this changed with the steam engine. Suddenly, energy itself was reconceptualized. Suddenly, energy was seen as just always lying around, ready to be used without consequence. There's no need to respect the steam engine, to let it rest, to nurture it, to coax it, to give back to it in exchange for what it gives to you. Rather than working with the natural world, humans necessarily began seeing themselves as over and against that world. Energy became something latent in nature, waiting to be used and harnessed, with no reciprocal demands placed on us whatsoever. And it's this worldview that has never changed since then. From the steam engine to internal combustion engines to the solar panel to the nuclear power plant, energy is still seen as ours for the taking. Whether it's photons streaming from the sun or the energy sitting inside an atom before it's ripped apart, we see something as sitting out there in nature, and all we have to do is unleash it so it will do our bidding. Perhaps it is this view that has led to our current problems. Not the fossil fuels per se, but the thinking of them as ours for the taking. Perhaps it is this underlying conceptualizing metaphor that needs to be abandoned as we search for a better future together. Still, when it comes to nuclear waste specifically, there are explicit and unambiguous costs and worries. The time span of radioactive waste makes it the sort of trash that's hard to think about because the time span is meaningless in everyday human scales. Plutonium-239, used in the production of nuclear weapons, has a half-life of 24,110 years. Uranium-234 and Neptunium-237, which are byproducts in most nuclear power plants, have half-lives of 240,000, 45,000 years, and 2.144 million years. Who will be in charge of watching over this waste in those futures? Even if we go with the smallest number here, plutonium-239's half-life of 24 millennia, will there even be humans in the year 26,000? For comparison, what were humans doing 24,000 years in the past? The short answer is, we really don't know. We call this the Upper Paleolithic period. We postulate from archaeological digs that some humans were just discovering pottery at the time. There was no farming, we think. Dogs were the only domesticated animal sharing a life with animals, we think. What is now the Sahara Desert was wet and fertile, and though humans were painting mysterious things on cave walls, written language was still another 18,000 years or so away from being developed. As for organizations or institutions, there's absolutely no evidence for anything like that existing back then. And that makes sense. Organizations are typically very short-lived. Even the Roman Empire lasted less than 500 years. France, as a monarchy, had a run of about 800 from the year 987 to the 1789 revolution. But modern nation states, they're an extremely recent human experiment. Who knows how long they'll be around? It's almost impossible to imagine that the United States will exist 1,000 years from now, let alone 24,000 years from now. So thinking about who's going to take care of half of the radioactive plutonium-239 that's still around in the year 26,000 is nearly a nonsense question. And if there are recognizable humans, will we today even know how to speak to them, leaving them notes and signs about the dangers in our trash heaps that are as mysterious to them as broken mammoth bones and strangely painted impossible animals on a cave wall are to us? For the last 40 years, there's been a plan to take most of America's nuclear waste and dump it underground at Yucca Mountain in Nevada. The U.S. Department of Energy was empowered by Congress in 1982 to oversee the process, running, and maintenance of this geological repository. The plan is that more than 300 million pounds of radioactive waste will be transported from around the country to Nevada, where it will be placed in a series of underground tunnels beneath the mountain, such that, if we're lucky, we'll never see it again, nothing bad or unexpected will ever happen, and everything will be perfectly safe. While Yucca Mountain is debated, the waste piles up at more than 100 different sites around the country. Nuclear power plants, for instance, put their waste in barrels, fill the barrels with an inert gas in the center, fill the outer cask with cement, weld the whole thing shut, and just wait. This dry cask storage system is popular for storing radioactive waste in the United States, Canada, Germany, Switzerland, Spain, Belgium, Sweden, Japan, Armenia, Argentina, Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, Hungary, South Korea, Romania, Slovakia, Ukraine, Lithuania, United Kingdom. Countries such as Russia and France use a slightly different system, and I could go on. Counting all of the nations of the world, there are billions of pounds of radioactive waste, and we really have no idea what to do with it. Now, part of the controversy surrounding dumping American waste in Yucca Mountain is that Yucca Mountain doesn't even belong to the United States. As part of the traditional land of the Western Shoshone tribe, the Yucca Mountain storage facility is a plan we shouldn't even really be talking about. So let's put aside for a moment that all of North America, including where we sit here tonight, is stolen land, and that the so-called treaties and accords that were bargained between the native people and the white settler governments were ones that were made under duress with ill intentions on the side of the US. Forgetting this general truth, if we investigate the history of Yucca Mountain specifically, we find that it falls on land covered in the 1863 Treaty of Ruby Valley. In this treaty, the Western Shoshone did not cede a single land claim to the US federal government. Rather, the Shoshone agreed to allow passage through the land and the right to build such things as railways through the land in exchange for the American government paying the tribe for the privilege to do so. But not a foot of soil was given away. The Western Shoshone today say, not only can't you store your nuclear trash in our mountain, but while we're on the subject, get off our land in general. And to be sure, the feds had been doing nefarious things on Shoshone land for some time. Not far from Yucca Mountain is the Nevada test site, the main testing ground for the US government's nuclear weapons. In 1945, the US bombed Hiroshima, Japan. Those who survived soon encountered 13 kilotons of nuclear fallout. Over a period of 40 years, the Nevada test site was host to so many nuclear explosions that 620 kilotons of radioactive fallout have blanketed Shoshone land. It's nearly 50 times as much as what fell on Hiroshima in an act of war. The usual tragic stories of cancers and birth defects result. And there's something even more insidious when we listen to the tribal spokesmen and elders explain that their way of life is being destroyed at an even deeper level by the radioactivity. Because, for instance, the Shoshone tradition is to hunt deer and then eat all parts of the inside of the deer before using the skin and inedible parts for other tasks, the Shoshone regularly consume deer organs, including thyroids, which store a much higher dose of radiation than other parts of irradiated deer. There's something horribly ironic about this. Because the Shoshone refused to waste any part of the animal that has sacrificed her life to feed them, they end up ingesting more of our nuclear waste and wasting away. That those who are historically the most mistreated and disrespected continue to receive the lion's share of mistreatment and disrespect in the modern nuclear age perhaps shouldn't come as a surprise, but it is telling. Why, after all, did we choose the Nevada desert for our testing and dumping ground? Because it's the desert. There are hardly any people there, and even fewer white people. There's no capitalist infrastructure to be harmed. There are no corporate headquarters or corporations looking to develop that land, not a single Amazon locker pickup point, nothing of import. It's just a desert. As just a desert, it doesn't appear as ethically significant. After all, if some cacti, snakes, deer, and Indians get nuked a bit, so goes the thinking, that makes a lot more sense than doing the tests in downtown Las Vegas, right? That's just pure common sense, which is a code word for utilitarianism, the greater good for the greater number of people. And so in closing then, and in the spirit of dumping our worst garbage underground, let me make it clear that I have come to bury utilitarianism, not to praise it. For the bloody math of the utilitarian calculus always and inevitably works out this way. The same atomism that is at work in physics is at work in utilitarianism. The same mathematics doing parallel calculations. There are, however, different value commitments working behind the scenes. Seeing the overall good as composed of atomistic, individualistic conceptions of the good is at the heart of utilitarianism. And the ethics is thus decided by summing up each individual, isolated notion of happiness, then doing whatever seems to make the majority the happiest when everything is subtracted and added up. This is an ethic that is custom-made to keep traditionally oppressed minorities oppressed well into the future. It is an ethic that masquerades murder for common sense, making it acceptable to pump poison into a mountain. It is an ethic that rationalizes dropping bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki for, as the great physicist Werner Heisenberg said at the time, it is probably the quickest way of ending this war and thus limiting further casualties. As an atomistic mathematical conception of morality, utilitarianism will basically let you get away with anything you want as long as you can make the numbers look acceptable. Perhaps 250,000 people eventually died as a direct result of the single atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. But even though that number includes such people as the young son and granddaughter of the mayor of Hiroshima, who were eating breakfast with him at the time and wouldn't have even had a moment to wonder what was happening before being vaporized, it would be good. And even though 2 American POWs being held in prison just 1,300 feet away from ground zero survived behind many feet of concrete, though they were badly injured in that Hiroshima blast, utilitarianism might also endorse as good the fact that several Japanese survivors of the blast then dragged those prisoners out to the remains of a nearby bridge and slowly stoned them to death in an emotional retaliation for what the United States had just done. Because if it pleased the crowd enough to purge that anger, that bloody execution would be moral. And when World War II was finally over, and 1/4 of Americans polled said that they wish it would last just a little bit longer so we could drop more atomic bombs on the Japanese, maybe, if we just worked on the numbers, that hateful wish could be seen as moral too. And round it goes, the utilitarian calculations doing the thinking for us so we never have to really think, so that we never really have to face the demands of true morality, so that we are truly lost. If there is perhaps one lesson we might allow to be taken away from such preliminary thinking here tonight, then the real task of thinking is what must be done when it looks like the thinking is already over. To see three differently colored strange quarks comprising an omega minus baryon particle takes some work. But once the concepts are so established that they disappear for us, it's worth not only returning to them and continuing to test our assumptions as science would demand, but to consider the possibility of a paradigm shift that alters the concepts radically and ushers in scientific revolution. When we complain about the small troubles in our life, true thinking calls on us to remember that all of our suffering, as well as all of our triumphs, will someday decay, disappear, be lost to entropy, the ultimate arbiter of permanence. And when we think that it's up to us to allow the suffering of others, and perhaps not merely allow, but even encourage that suffering, in the name of an ethic that pretends it can calculate a finite moral responsibility and a precisely summed up end that justifies the means, then true thinking requires us to step back, adjust the scale, consider that we might not only need a different answer, but a different set of questions, and then radiate with a glowing white-hot passion, the sort of moral care and compassion that cannot show itself on an accountant's ledger, but instead points toward a radically revolutionary and just future for us all. We need historians, philosophers, scientists, and artists to accomplish this thinking. We need regular people to think beyond unthinking. We are all in this together, soon to live through a collective winter that we hope is not nuclear. For as James Joyce reminded us in an earlier story, snow was generally all over Ireland. It was falling softly upon the bog of Allen, and further westwards, softly falling into the dark, mutinous Shannon waves. It was falling too upon every part of the lonely churchyard where Michael Fury lay buried. It lay thickly drifted on the crooked crosses and headstones, on the spears of the little gate, on the barren thorns. His soul swooned slowly as he heard the snow falling faintly through the universe, and faintly falling like the descent of their last end upon all the living and the dead. And now to begin tonight's event in earnest. Yuki Miyamoto is an associate professor of religious studies here at DePaul. She was also a 2017 to 2019 DePaul Humanities Center fellow. Yuki's fellowship appointment with us officially ended last spring, and though I'm fortunate to work on the same campus with her, I think all of us at the center are sad about not having her around the DHC regularly as part of our official center business any longer. Yuki's main areas of research focus on nuclear discourse and environmental ethics, with a special focus on Japan. Her book, Beyond the Mushroom Cloud, Commemoration, Religion, and Responsibility After Hiroshima, is a thoughtful and creative project that examines how survivors of the atomic bombings of 1945 came to terms with the nuclear attacks given the context of their religious traditions. An ethicist, historian, and scholar of religion, I'm so pleased that Yuki could be with us tonight and add her voice to the proceedings. With her talk entitled Radiation and Discrimination in Hiroshima, Fukushima, and Beyond, please join me in welcoming Yuki Miyamoto.
Thank you, Peter, for a generous introduction, and also thank you so much for putting this together, Anna as well, and the staff members of the Humanities Centers, and thank you everyone who are here, coming here tonight. So Peter talks a little bit about metaphor, and my new title is Blood as Metaphor, and kegare, illness, and discrimination against the irradiated body in Japan. Introduction. When I present a hibakusha, a person who is affected by a nuclear explosion and radiation exposure, and his or her testimony to an American audience, one of the responses I sometimes receive is that they had not heard of discrimination against the hibakusha and their offspring in Japan. 74 years after the historical event, this may be the case in Japan too. On this topic, the journalist Chujo Kazuo compiled a book in 1986 based on the interviews he had conducted about hibakusha and the discrimination against them. The first story was the account of Kubo Fumiko, a hibakusha who lost her son to radiation-induced cancer over 30 years after the event. While she was working as a nurse at the atomic bomb hospital in Hiroshima after the war, a hospitalized young man told her that his younger brother in Tokyo had been evicted from a boarding house because of the radiation sickness from the atomic bombing that this patient in Hiroshima was suffering, as if the illness was inherited to the younger brother. Kubo also witnessed the nationally and internationally acclaimed photographer Domon Ken, his discriminatory behavior during his numerous visits to Hiroshima. Domon began visiting Hiroshima in 1957, and his photo book, Hiroshima, came out the following year. He revisited Hiroshima in 1968 and published another photo book, Ikiteiru Hiroshima, in 1978. During his visits, Domon would go to the atomic bomb hospital. Quote, even though he came to the hospital many times, testified Kubo, and took many photos of hibakusha from various angles, Domon never shook hands with them or even touched their beds. He appeared quite fastidious about cleanness, but he may have thought that their illness was contagious. If coming into contact with a hibakusha patient would lead to one's death, I would have died a long time ago. Unquote. It remains uncertain to this day whether Domon's avoidance of hibakusha stems from professional reasons that we do not know of or from his fear of contracting illness. Yet Kubo, having witnessed the cases like this for many years, was troubled by Domon's behavior, which can be interpreted that he treated the patient's illness as contagious, that is, any contact with hibakusha would affect his health. Another case that Chujo reports in the book took place in 1976, when Kondo Nobuyoshi, a member of the Tokyo Metropolitan Assembly, proposed at an assembly meeting the sterilization of hibakusha. What prompted Kondo's recommendation was the assembly's discussion of whether the metropolitan government should provide health care to the second generation of hibakusha, as was granted to the hibakusha. Given the fact that Kondo was a medical doctor, his proposal cannot be attributed merely to his ignorance. Also, even after his statement, he was elected 4 times consecutively. However, all these examples took place some time ago, and the situation might be better now. Or so one may have thought until the meltdown of the Fukushima nuclear power plant in 2011. Unfortunately, the evacuees were treated as contaminants, bullied at the new school to which the evacuated children were transferred, and shunned in a new community. One evacuee told a newspaper reporter, "I know of others whose cars were damaged on purpose because they had a Fukushima license plate. That's why I never parked my car in the middle of the parking lot." This paper will examine why hibakusha have been discriminated against in Japan, while, as is happening in Fukushima, the health effects of radiation exposure are downplayed, if not treated as non-existent. In order to compare the discrimination against hibakusha to the historical pattern of discriminatory treatment in Japan, I first discuss hibakusha representation and move on to the history of Japan's discourse on biopower and biopolitics in the context of population control and eugenics, and show how the resulting policies generated the prototype of discrimination that prevails today, touching upon the religious underpinnings of these policies. Any political entity necessitates stories to legitimize its reign, which is often exalted as myths, so that making a challenge to it would be a taboo. And it is the story that justifies the exclusion of a certain group of people. What is required of us is not simply to discard all myths or to replace one collective narrative with another. Rather, I argue that we need to cultivate an attitude suggested by John Berger, the English novelist and art critic. Never again will a single Never again will a single story be taken as though it is the only one. In post-atomic age, where everyone can be hibakusha, what we may need is to cultivate our patience to embrace multiple stories, including myths, and maturity to bear with ambiguities. For familiarizing ourselves with more than one story will allow us to objectify the values, norms, and myth that we are immersed in, which will enable us to distinguish the stories that protect the lives from the ones that abide us and draw us to a contaminated soil. From visible to invisible scars. For the purpose of understanding discrimination against hibakusha, let us first trace their representation in a wider society. In the first decade after the bombing, the representation of the atomic bombing was often confined to external injuries. For example, Kiyoshi Kikkawa, whose back was covered with keloids due to the combination of heat and radiation from the bombing, was named the A-bomb victim #1 by an American journalist. Instead of feeling ashamed of his scars, he began to earn money by showing his back to foreign correspondents and tourists. Another publicized case was that of the Hiroshima maidens. 25 scarred women from Hiroshima were invited to the US in 1955 to receive reconstructive surgery free of charge, thanks to many good-willed people who donated their time and skills. While some historians saw American benevolence in hosting those women, other scholars have pointed out that the message the media disseminated was not about the plight of the women or the horror of nuclear weapons. The case was viewed as an opportunity to promulgate a new identity for post-war US citizens, that of white, middle-class, Christian, generous, suburban, heterosexual, nuclear families. These scholars argue that the maiden's visit was used to reinforce this image of Americans who offered to show mercy to their former enemies. Of course, it was not only the American media that made use of the maidens to serve for a political agenda. The disfigured women were invited to come from Hiroshima to Tokyo for the surgery. Unbeknownst to the patients, prior to the surgery, the organizers of this trip planned to visit the Sugamo prison, where Class B and C war criminals were interned. Upon the women's visit, 2 war criminals who had been high-ranking officers during the war greeted them as representative of the inmates. One woman said, "Once I held a grudge by blaming my misfortune on the military officers, but now I understand that they have suffered as much as we have." Their meeting was taken as a reconciliation of Japanese victimizers and the victims, as if this encounter made Japanese war responsibility disappear and the officers' sin to be forgiven. Sadako and the 1,000 paper cranes is one of the more popular accounts in Japan, as in the States, of the atomic bombing. The story is about a young girl, Sasaki Sadako, who survived the atomic bombing despite being only a mile from the hypocenter at the age of 2. After growing into a healthy and athletic girl, one day, 10 years after the bombing, Sadako noticed that her lymph nodes were swollen. She was diagnosed with leukemia, according to Japanese folkloric belief in which one's dream will come true if one folds 1,000 paper cranes. She began to fold the cranes at the hospital. Despite folding over 1,000 cranes, she passed away at the age of 12. After Sadako's death, her classmates decided to erect a memorial to her and began to raise funds for it. Thanks to this movement, Sadako's story came to be well known, and the statue was built in Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park in 1958. Because of this story and those of other youth who died prematurely from radiation-induced leukemia, the representation of hibakusha broadened from one of the external injury to one of internal illnesses such as leukemia and cancer. By the 1980s, the association of the atomic bombing with radiation-induced leukemia was further propagated through visual representations in TV shows and films. A 1989 film, Black Rain, was based upon the renowned writer Ibuse Masuji's semi-fictional novel of 1965, while Yumechiyo Diary by screenwriter Hayasaka Akira appeared first as a TV drama series from 1981 through 1984, and then as a movie in 1985. The film critic Maya Morioka Todeschini criticizes the romanticization and even eroticization of the bodies of sick young women in these atomic bomb films. The protagonists of these films, described as beautiful maidens, manifest their characters following certain tropes: being beautiful inside out, being good daughters, suffering in silence, being rejected by or refusing love interests because of their illness, and being doomed to premature death. Illness as metaphor. Such tropes remind some of Susan Sontag's piece on illness as metaphor, in which she examines the romanticizing of tuberculosis and analyzes the meaning of the illness in such a representation. At the beginning of the 19th century, TB was conceived as a variant of the disease of love, and fever in TB was a sign of an inward burning, and thus it was considered as a disease of passion. The Romantics moralized the death in a new way with the TB death, which dissolved the gross body, etherealized the personality, expanded consciousness. It was equally possible, through fantasies about TB, to aestheticize death. Influenced by this literal fervor, literature in Japanese produced similar stories in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, in which young women die prematurely from TB. A notable example is Tokutomi Roka's 1900 novel Hototogisu, which depicts the noble tubercular maiden Namiko with a pale white face that contrasts with her black hair, cheek rosy with fever, and sanguine stains on the sheets. As Sontag further points out, TB is disintegration, febrilization, dematerialization. It is a disease of liquids, the body turning into phlegm and mucus and sputum and finally blood. As TB is ultimately a disease of blood, so is leukemia in the Japanese imagination. The associations that the Romantics evoked about TB, a disease of passion, of love, and of blood, are all applicable to the case of radiation-induced leukemia as a representation of hibakusha. Sontag further claims that illnesses have always been used as metaphors to enliven charges that a society was corrupt or unjust. Disease imagery is used to express concern for social order, and health is something everyone is presumed to know about, unquote. If her analysis of disease is right, how can a beautiful and moralized image of hibakusha's illness induce discriminatory behavior? To put it differently, examining the radiation-induced blood disease in Japan will reveal the values of a given society that perceive such an illness as a threat to social order and norms. History of the blood taboo in Japan. The avoidance of coming to contact with blood, known as a taboo called ketsue, is observed in the 9th century records of Kotai Jingu Gishikicho and Konin Shiki, which specify the procedures of Shinto rituals. Some scholars think the idea of ketsue influenced the contemporary discrimination against hibakusha, while others think that love marriage, as the medical doctor and literary critic Kato Shuichi claims, raised awareness of choosing a spouse with a good background, which used to be a task of the go-between in the arranged marriage. But more importantly than the Shinto-based blood taboo and the popularity of love marriage, I believe, are Japan's 19th century nationalism and militarism. Modeling after the Western countries, it was an urgent task for Japan to have a Western-style military and soldiers with sturdy bodies. Then the health of the people became a government concern, especially as the democratization of military, whereby the honor to serve was not saved for a privileged class of samurai or warrior, but for everyone, constitutes an essential part of the nation state. Once the national government controlled its subjects' bodies, its biopower determined the desirability of the body, which suggests that promoting the healthful body and eliminating the useless body were two sides of the same coin. Japan again followed its predecessors. After several battles and conflicts on their own soil and in colonized lands, the European elites began to worry about population decline. In particular, those who were strong enough to go to the battlefield perished, while the weak stayed home and survived. This was when Francis Galton, a cousin of Charles Darwin, advocated establishing eugenics as a field of study. The idea of eugenics was soon introduced to Japan by Fukuzawa Yukichi, known as a public intellectual who currently appears on the Japanese 10,000 yen banknote. As the idea of eugenics spread, mental and physical disorders came to be attributed entirely to blood. Hansen's disease and tuberculosis, for example, are transmitted through bacteria. However, even after they were medically proven not to be hereditary, people still linked those illnesses to blood, resulting in their shunning any contact, not only with the patient, but also with the entire family. In fact, people saw bad blood not only in illness, but also in vices, laziness, and characters prone to crime. Nationalism, religion, and eugenics. The idea of eugenics combined with militarism was supported by nationalism. Japanese elites discussed the enhancement of Japanese bodies to make them comparable to those of their Western counterparts. Some proposed interracial marriage, while others opposed it due to fear that interracial marriage would allow Western blood to dominate Japan. Because they faced the difficulty in achieving their goal in a short span, eugenics became more appealing to them. The journalist Ikeda Ringi's Yusei Undo, or the eugenics movement, and Tokyo University medical doctor Nagai Hisomu's advocacy of eugenics culminated in the passing of a bill, Kokumin Yusei Ho, the National Eugenics Law, in 1940, which would enable doctors to sterilize those who were physically and mentally unwanted and unsuitable. Behind the implementation of eugenics lay what Takemoto Nina, a scholar known for studying eugenics and the regulation of prostitutes, regard as the three background conditions of Japan's acceptance of eugenics. First, the introduction of evolutionary theory and the discipline of genetics from the West. Second, the Sino-Japanese and Russo-Japanese wars in 1894 and 1904, respectively, necessitating an increased population for the Japanese empire. And third, the impact of America's legalization of sterilization beginning in the state of Indiana in 1907. While journalists and medical doctors were involved in this movement, enlightening people with advanced scientific knowledge of heredity, the promulgation of eugenics was also attributed to religious teachings and activists. Kagawa Toyohiko, who was once described as the Gandhi of Japan in the New York Times, was more famous in the United States than in Japan as a fervent Christian missionary. In fact, he devoted his life to social justice, in particular to ameliorating lives in the shanty town of Kobe, as well as in other industrialized cities in Japan. However, he was the one who suggested, through morality and religious teachings, to execute jinshu kairyo, or the betterment of the Japanese race, indicating sterilization. In other words, he saw that social justice and sterilization were not contradictory. Rather, he believed eugenics as one of the solutions to prevalent social concerns. He even stated that the wicked, the criminals, the mentally challenged and disturbed were all affected by their heritage through blood. It was thus not a coincidence that this is the time when the Japanese myth of an imperial lineage traced to deities was emphasized and taught in schools throughout Japan. A teacher would ask a student why one should be grateful for being a Japanese. The correct answer of the time was that Japan was a sacred country reigned over by an emperor who was a living god. The deification of the emperor was secured by the bloodline, which allegedly had never been broken. The myth was used to inculcate not only a new identity of unified Japanese subjects, but also to impose the imperial ideology based upon the sacred blood. That was why, even at the end of the 20th century, some adamantly opposed the idea of a blood transfusion to the emperor's body when the Showa emperor was on his deathbed at the end of 1988. To them, such a medical procedure would contaminate the sacred blood running through his body since the beginning of Japan. This explains that what threatens the social order and norms was not hibakusha's bad blood per se, but the mixture of the two, the good and bad blood, through physical contact or conjugal relations to damage the healthy nation. Conclusion. The political agenda of producing a healthy nation encouraged its subjects, on the one hand, to venerate the imperial family, and on the other, justified social and legal discrimination against people whose blood does not conform to the sacred blood of Japan. The discrimination against hibakusha was built upon such an ideology and is still alive to this day. When their disease was associated literally and euphemistically with bad blood, unfit for a healthy nation, they and their families become targets of discrimination. The scholar and the public intellectual Oguri Eiji, who once examined the origin and dissemination of the persistent myth of the Japanese as homogeneous, argues for not creating another myth to conquer the existing one, but extricating oneself from such a myth. While the blood myth has been called into question by scholars like Oguri, cases of discrimination against hibakusha have not ceased. In fact, they resurged after the Fukushima nuclear power plant accident, as was mentioned at the beginning. Contrary to Oguri, I believe that the solution may not be to emancipate ourselves from any myth, as we are beings who need to narrativize our lives to maintain oneself and our collective self. In order to choose the one, though, that reassures our survival, we must be open to many stories and values reflecting the reality of diverse and multivalent world, where our irreplaceable attributes that once inspired discrimination may become unique qualities or mere idiosyncrasies rather than signs of inferiority. Thank you.